Squealer nodded, his loyalty to Napoleon unwavering. As Snowball's plan gained momentum, he and Napoleon hatched a plan of their own. Napoleon had been nurturing a silent power in the background, the puppies he had taken under his care and trained in secret. They were no longer the innocent, playful pups of months passed under Napoleon's hand. They had grown strong and fierce, their loyalty absolute, their minds conditioned to obey without question. Snowball, unaware of Napoleon's growing hostility, continued to push forward with his plans. At every meeting he urged the animals to imagine the farm they could create together, and with each speech, more animals began to support him. The windmill project became a symbol of their shared dream, a beacon of hope. Snowball drew up blueprints on the barn wall, tracing the outlines of gears and turbines, explaining to the animals how they would harness the wind's power. He encouraged the animals to learn, to understand how the machine would work, and he shared every detail with an openness that endeared him to the others. Finally, the day came when the animals would vote on whether to proceed with the windmill. They gathered in the barn, a buzz of excitement and tension filling the air. Snowball stood before them, his heart pounding with anticipation. He looked into the faces of his comrades, seeing their trust, their hope, and he felt a surge of purpose.
Comrades,
He began, his voice steady but filled with emotion.
today we stand on the brink of something extraordinary. This windmill is not just a machine, it is a promise of a better future. A future where we, the animals, control our labor, where we are no longer bound to the grindstone. A future of warmth, light, and dignity. Imagine the nights we will spend in comfort, the ease of our work, the time we will have to live, to grow, to think.
The animals were spellbound, their hearts swelling with hope. Snowball's words painted pictures in their minds, images of a life beyond work, beyond struggle. Many were already nodding in agreement, their faces alight with anticipation. But just as Snowball was finishing his speech, Napoleon rose from the shadows, a dark presence against the hopeful glow in the animal's eyes. He stepped forward, his expression cold, his posture commanding.
Comrades,
He said in a low, powerful voice.
Snowball's ideas are nothing more than fantasies. Building this windmill would only distract us from our real work, weaken us, and waste our resources. We must focus on strengthening the farm, not on chasing impossible dreams.
A murmur of uncertainty spread through the animals. Napoleon's words were like cold water on the fire of their enthusiasm, and a feeling of doubt began to creep in. Could Snowball's vision really be as impractical as Napoleon claimed? Could this dream of the windmill be just a distraction? The barn was thick with tension, the animals glancing between Snowball and Napoleon, torn between two visions of the future. Just as Snowball opened his mouth to respond, Napoleon gave a sharp whistle. Before any of the animals could react, a pack of large, snarling dogs rushed into the barn, their eyes blazing, their teeth bared. They were the puppies Napoleon had secretly raised and trained, now fully grown and loyal only to him. The animals gasped in horror, watching as the dogs lunged toward Snowball, their growls filling the air with menace. Snowball barely had time to react. He spun around, his heart pounding with a mixture of shock and fear, and bolted out of the barn with the dogs close on his heels. The animals watched, frozen, as Snowball ran for his life, his once confident stride now a desperate sprint. Snowball reached the fence and, with one last, desperate leap, scrambled over it, just as the dogs snapped at his heels. He vanished into the night, his figure silhouetted for a moment against the moon before he disappeared, leaving the animals in stunned silence. Their hearts were heavy, a sense of loss settling over them. They had believed in Snowball, in his dream, and now he was gone, chased away by the very animals he had helped to free. In the days that followed, Napoleon took swift control of Animal Farm, abolishing the regular meetings where ideas had once been freely exchanged. There will be no more debates, he announced, his voice ringing with finality. From now on, I alone will make the decisions. It is for your own good. We must remain united, focused. Too much debate is dangerous, divisive. The animals, still reeling from Snowball's sudden expulsion, were too shocked to protest. They missed Snowball's leadership, his vision, but they were also fearful, uncertain of what would happen if they questioned Napoleon. Squealer, sensing their confusion, stepped in, his smooth voice weaving a web of explanations that soothed their doubts.
Comrades,
He assured them.
it was for your own protection. Snowball was a traitor, a danger to us all. Napoleon always supported the windmill. He only pretended to oppose it to flush out Snowball's true intentions.
Some of the animals exchanged confused glances. Hadn't Napoleon been clear in his opposition to the windmill? But Squealer was relentless, his words dripping with conviction.
You must remember, comrades, that Napoleon has always been right. He is a true leader, and everything he does is for the good of Animal Farm. You wouldn't want Mr. Jones to return, would you?
The mention of Jones was enough to stifle any lingering questions. The animals, haunted by memories of their former master's cruelty, lowered their heads in acceptance. They were fearful, disoriented, unsure of what had really happened or what their future would hold. Napoleon's authority settled over the farm like a dark cloud, casting long shadows over their dreams and hopes. In the days that followed, construction on the windmill began not as Snowball had envisioned it, as a project of shared hope and progress, but as a symbol of Napoleon's control, his command. The animals worked harder than ever, pushing themselves beyond exhaustion, but the sense of joy, of shared purpose, was gone. They labored in silence, driven not by hope but by obedience, and the once bright spirit of Animal Farm dimmed, shadowed by doubt and betrayal. In the quiet hours, as they rested their tired bodies, the animals would sometimes whisper to each other, their voices hushed and filled with sorrow. They spoke of Snowball, of his dream, of a future they had once believed in, but those dreams seemed distant now, as if they had belonged to a different time, a different life. And as Napoleon stood atop the hill, watching over the farm he now controlled, a sense of finality settled over Animal Farm. The dream had not died, but it had been twisted, reshaped by power and fear, and the animals could feel, deep in their hearts, that they were no longer free. The days stretched long, and the seasons turned, each one colder and harsher than the last. The animals, their bodies aching from the never-ending toil, labored relentlessly to rebuild the windmill. It was no longer a hopeful symbol of the freedom they had fought so hard to achieve. Now it was a heavy burden, a constant reminder of their subjugation under Napoleon's iron fist. The dream of a prosperous future, one filled with rest and comfort, had long faded. Instead, they worked from dawn to dusk, their muscles sore, their spirits broken. Napoleon, ever the shrewd and calculating leader, watched from a distance, his gaze cold and calculating. The windmill was no longer a tool for their collective liberation, it had become a tool for his consolidation of power. His commands were issued with an unyielding authority, his words absolute, and any dissent was crushed swiftly and without mercy. But there was an undercurrent of doubt among the animals. They were not blind to the fact that life on Animal Farm had become harder, more oppressive than it had ever been under Mr. Jones. They worked harder than they ever had before, and yet their stomachs were emptier, their lives more miserable. At first, there had been a sense of solidarity in their labor, the animals working together for a common cause, united in their purpose. But as Napoleon's rule tightened, the gap between the pigs and the other animals grew wider. The pigs, those who had once spoken of equality and brotherhood, were now the first to break the very commandments they had once sworn to uphold. The notion of animalism, of all animals being equal, was slipping further and further from their grasp. Napoleon, ever keen to preserve his power, began making deals with the human farmers, something that would have been unthinkable under the old ideals of animalism. The sight of Napoleon shaking hands with the humans, a practice once condemned as a symbol of betrayal, was a bitter pill for the animals to swallow. The principles of animalism, those noble ideals of solidarity and self-sufficiency, had been shattered. But no one dared question Napoleon's actions. Those who did were quickly silenced. One cold winter's night, the pigs moved into the farmhouse. They had been using the humans' former residence as a place to store supplies. But now, with increasing frequency, the pigs were seen entering and leaving the house. They were no longer content with merely using the farmhouse for storage. Napoleon, always the opportunist, had long since abandoned the idea of equality. The pigs, now enjoying luxuries that the other animals could only dream of, began to indulge in the comforts of the humans' former lives. They slept on beds, ate special meals, and enjoyed the warmth of the fire while the other animals froze outside. The contrast was stark and painful. One day the animals saw the pigs lounging in the farmhouse, their faces full of contentment. They had been told that no animal would sleep in a bed, for such luxuries were the domain of humans. It was one of the original commandments, written boldly on the barn wall for all to see, but now, the pigs had changed the wording of that commandment. No animal shall sleep in a bed with sheets, it read, a subtle alteration that allowed the pigs to justify their actions. The animals, confused and disillusioned, whispered among themselves, but no one dared speak out loud. What could they say? The pigs were their leaders now, their masters, and they had learned from painful experience that resistance was futile. As the windmill took shape, Napoleon continued to force the animals to work harder than ever. The once vibrant hope that had fueled the rebellion seemed to be slipping away, buried beneath the weight of their endless toil. The animals could feel it, their bodies were breaking, their spirits crumbling. Yet still they worked, day after day, driven not by the ideals of animalism, but by fear, exhaustion, and the need to survive. They could only hope that once the windmill was completed, their lives would improve. But disaster struck, as it always did. A violent storm swept through the farm one fateful night, tearing down the windmill they had worked so hard to build. When the animals woke the next morning, they were met with the sight of the broken ruins, a symbol of their shattered hopes and dreams. The windmill, which had once represented their future, lay in pieces on the ground, its twisted metal and broken stones scattered across the field like the remnants of their once bright future. The animals gathered in silence around the wreckage, their faces grim and somber. Boxer's eyes, which had once gleamed with hope and pride, were clouded with confusion and sorrow.
We'll rebuild it,
he said, his voice low and determined.
We must rebuild it. We cannot let it be destroyed.
But as the animals turned to Napoleon for guidance, they saw only the cold, calculating expression on his face. He looked down at them with a sense of disdain, as though their grief and confusion were beneath him. His eyes were filled with contempt, but he knew that he could not afford to show weakness. The animals, no matter how worn down they were, still believed in the idea of the windmill. They needed something to believe in, something to hold on to. Napoleon wasted no time in finding a scapegoat for the disaster. He blamed Snowball, the pig he had driven into exile, for the destruction of the windmill.
Snowball has sabotaged us,
he declared, his voice cold and filled with accusation.
He has returned to the farm under the cover of darkness, and he has destroyed our work. He seeks to undermine our progress and sabotage everything we have built. This is treachery, comrades. Snowball is the enemy.
Squealer, ever the loyal propagandist, immediately backed up in Napoleon's claim.
Snowball is behind every setback,
he said, his voice smooth and persuasive.
You saw him in the Battle of the Cowshed. He was a coward, a traitor. It is his desire to see us fail that drives him to such acts of sabotage. He would rather see us starve than succeed.
The animals, already worn down by the hardships of their labor, had no choice but to accept this new version of events. They had seen Snowball flee in the wake of Napoleon's attack, but the idea that Snowball could be behind the destruction of the windmill felt too far-fetched, too out of reach. And yet, they dared not question it. To do so would be to question the very system that had replaced their old lives of servitude with this new form of tyranny. The fear of retribution, the knowledge that resistance meant suffering, was enough to keep the animals silent, a mother prayant, westward leading, together to the sky. Napoleon, seizing the opportunity, ordered the animals to rebuild the windmill.
We will not be defeated by this setback. We will rebuild, stronger than ever. Snowball thinks he can break us, but we will prove him wrong.
The animals, feeling the weight of the loss, their bodies aching and their spirits battered, reluctantly returned to work. They had no choice. The windmill must be rebuilt, not just to restore their hopes for a better life, but to prove to themselves that they could endure whatever Napoleon threw at them. And so, once again, the animals labored under the oppressive gaze of their rulers, their bodies bent with exhaustion and their minds filled with doubt. The days grew longer, the work harder, but still they pressed on, driven by the fear of punishment and the faint, flickering hope that someday, somehow, they might find a way to break free. But deep in their hearts, they knew the truth. The dream of Animal Farm, the dream that had once burned so brightly in their hearts, was dying. The pigs, those who had once spoken of equality and justice, had become indistinguishable from the humans they had overthrown. The walls of the barn, once adorned with the noble commandments of animalism, were now distorted, warped beyond recognition. The lies that were fed to them by the humans, the deep in their hearts that were fed to them. And so they worked, and they worked, and they worked. But the light of their dream, the dream of a better world, grew dimmer with each passing day. As the bleak winter months dragged on, the cold seemed to seep into every corner of Animal Farm, much like the desolation that had taken root in the hearts of the animals. The crops were sparse, the barn doors creaked with the wind, and the very earth seemed to resist the animals' desperate attempts to cultivate it. But it wasn't just the harsh weather that was wearing them down. It was the constant hunger, the unrelenting labor, and the hollow feeling of betrayal that lingered in the air like a sickness, one that none could escape. The animals had hoped that their sacrifices, their struggles and toil, would yield some reward, some light at the end of the tunnel. But that light seemed ever more distant, obscured by the dark clouds of their unfulfilled hopes. Napoleon, their supreme leader, did nothing to ease their suffering. Instead, he masked the farm's true condition with lies, weaving a tapestry of deception and propaganda to make the world feel better because their voices had been suppressed. Squealer, ever the faithful mouthpiece, stood at the forefront of these efforts, spinning the truth until it became a grotesque parody of itself. The animals, their stomachs empty and their bones aching, watched in disbelief as he parroted stories of bumper crops and prosperity to the humans who visited.
The farm is thriving,
he declared with a glint in his eyes, his voice a silken thread of falsehood that wrapped around the minds of the gullible.
Never before has Animal Farm known such success. Our windmill is progressing, and our animals are healthy and content.
But the reality was far different. The animals knew it, even if they could never say it aloud. They were starving. Their coats were thin and matted, their eyes hollow with fatigue. The work was never ending, and the promises that had once filled them with hope were now nothing more than cruel mockeries. They had become pawns in Napoleon's game, tokens in his twisted empire, manipulated by propaganda and fear. The breaking point came when Napoleon made his decision to sell eggs, an action that went against everything they had once stood for. The hens, those poor creatures, had been the first to suffer under Napoleon's reign, their lives now reduced to a mere function of the farm's production. When they were told they must part with their eggs, something in them snapped. They had endured enough. They could not let this final betrayal slide. Fate. The rebellion was small, but it was fierce. The hens clucked in defiance, their feathers ruffled with anger. They took to the rafters, refusing to lay eggs. They squawked and fluttered, a sea of rebellion, their cries echoing through the barn as they flung their eggs at the humans who had come to collect. It was an act of defiance, a desperate, futile cry for justice in a world that had abandoned them. But it was also a last act of solidarity, a refusal to give in to the oppression that had become their reality. Napoleon's response was swift and brutal. The chickens were rounded up, their wings twisted and their beaks silenced. The air grew thick with the stench of fear as Napoleon issued his orders. "Crack down on them. Show no mercy," he barked, his voice sharp and final. The animals watched in horror as Napoleon's dogs, those monstrous creatures he had bred and trained in secret, descended upon the rebellious hens. The animals, too afraid to intervene, could only look on as the hens were dragged away. The sound of their terrified clucking filled the air for a moment, but soon it was drowned out by the deafening silence that followed. Some hens were never seen again. Their bodies, broken and battered, had been thrown into the cold earth, their spirits extinguished, like the flame of a candle snuffed out too soon. Their deaths were a message, a reminder that resistance would not be tolerated, that defiance would be crushed under the weight of Napoleon's absolute power. The animals were left to mourn in secret, their grief muffled by the fear that weighed heavily upon them. Yet even in death, the hens had given their lives in the name of something greater, something they believed in, something they could never let go of. And so the atmosphere on Animal Farm grew colder still, not just from the unrelenting winter, but from the deep sense of dread that hung in the air. Napoleon's grip on the farm tightened, and with each passing day, he grew more tyrannical, more merciless. He had learned from the past that the only way to secure his rule was to instill fear in the hearts of the animals. And so he began his purges. The public executions began quietly at first, a few animals led away by the dogs, their faces pale with terror, their eyes wide with disbelief. The first to be executed were those who had dared to speak out against Napoleon's rule, those who had once been loyal to the cause but had now turned against him. The accusations were always vague, whispers of treason, of collaboration with Snowball, of plotting to overthrow the great leader. Never, there were no trials, no witnesses, no opportunity for defense. The accused were simply dragged to the front of the crowd, their faces pleading for mercy, and executed without a second thought. The sight of the blood-stained ground, the lifeless bodies of the animals who had once been comrades, was enough to shake the very core of Animal Farm. But still, the animals were silent. They dared not speak out. What was the point? Every murmur of dissent was met with immediate reprisal. Napoleon had created a climate of fear so pervasive, so overwhelming, that even the faintest whisper of protest was enough to bring swift and brazen whisper of protest was enough to bring whispers from the startled silence. What was the point? Every murmur of dissent was enough to precipitate a huge storm. And yet, even in the face of such horrors, Squealer was there, always ready with an excuse, a justification. His voice, smooth and comforting, slipped into the ears of the animals, softening the blow of the bloodshed they had witnessed. His smile,
"It was necessary,"
he would say, his eyes glistening with false sincerity.
"Comrades, you must understand that these sacrifices were for the greater good. We must purge the farm of those who would work against us. For if we do not, the enemy, those who seek to destroy us, will destroy us all."
The animals nodded in silence, their minds clouded by the fog of fear and confusion. Squealer's words wrapped around them like a drug, dulling the pain of their guilt and despair. He assured them that they were doing the right thing, that every death was a step toward the glorious future they had once dreamed of. And yet, in their hearts, the animals knew the truth. The future they had been promised had long since turned to dust. There was no liberation, no equality, no justice. There was only the oppressive rule of Napoleon, the never-ending toil, and the fear that lurked around every corner. The purges continued, each execution more brutal than the last. The names of the traitors, real or imagined, were written down in history, and with each name, the dream of animalism died a little more. The animals were no longer free, and they could no longer remember a time when they had been. The commandments, once boldly written on the barn wall, had become a mere shell of their former selves. Each one had been altered, twisted to suit Napoleon's whims. Ew, animals are equal, it said, but beneath that, the fine print read, "But some animals are more equal than others." And so they lived in the cold and darkness, bound by the lies they had been fed, shackled by the fear that ruled their lives. The animals, once full of hope, now moved like ghosts, their eyes hollow and their hearts heavy. They no longer dreamed of a better world, for they knew the bitter truth. The revolution had failed, and they were no better off than they had been before. In the end, the pigs had become indistinguishable from the humans they had once overthrown. They wore the same clothes, drank the same alcohol, and slept in the same beds. The farm was theirs, and the animals were nothing more than tools to be used and discarded as needed. The dream of equality of justice, of freedom, had all been swept away, replaced by a new tyranny that was just as cruel, just as corrupt, and just as unrelenting as the one that had come before. And as the wind howled through the barn, the animals knew, deep down, that they had lost something they would never be able to regain. The dream of Animal Farm had died, and with it, the hope for a better future. As the days continued to pass, the oppressive atmosphere on Animal Farm only deepened, and the bitter winds of winter seemed to pierce not just the animals' bodies, but their very spirits. The farm, once a place of hope and possibility, had become a shadow of its former self, haunted by the unrelenting grip of tyranny. Napoleon, who had long since abandoned any pretense of equality, ruled with an iron fist, and the animals had grown numb to the horrors they witnessed every day. The commandments that had once been boldly inscribed on the barn wall, their words a symbol of unity and shared purpose, had begun to change. It had started subtly, at first a word here, a phrase there, but soon, the alterations were so frequent that no one could keep track. No animal shall sleep in a bed became no animal shall sleep in a bed with sheets. No animal shall drink alcohol was amended to no animal shall drink alcohol to excess. The commandments had become nothing more than convenient tools for the pigs to justify their increasingly lavish lifestyle. The other animals, too intimidated by Napoleon's power to protest, had grown accustomed to the changes, as though they were simply part of life now. And yet, deep within their hearts, a faint stir of sorrow and confusion lingered, though no one dared to voice it. It was in the midst of this confusion that a new disaster struck, one that would further devastate the already fragile morale of the animals. Napoleon, in his thirst for power and resources, entered into a trade deal with Mr. Frederick, a neighboring farmer known for his cruelty and greed. The deal was fraught with rumors of Frederick's treachery, but Napoleon, eager for the timber he so desperately needed, dismissed the warnings. The pigs were convinced that the exchange of timber for money would be the turning point for the farm, the means to restore some semblance of stability to their lives. But when the time came for Frederick to pay, the animals discovered the cruel truth. The money he had offered was counterfeit, a cruel hoax designed to cheat them out of their resources. The pigs, enraged by the betrayal, had no choice but to confront Frederick, but the damage had already been done. It wasn't just the stolen timber, it was the humiliation, the realization that they had been outwitted and deceived by a human they had once looked down upon. Napoleon, his fury burning like a wildfire, could not allow this insult to go unanswered. He immediately ordered his dogs to attack any of Frederick's men they could catch, but it was clear that the farm was now in grave danger. Frederick, in turn, prepared for retaliation, gathering his men and coming at Animal Farm with a ferocity that matched Napoleon's own. The tension in the air was palpable as the day of the attack approached. The animals, knowing they could not afford to lose this battle, gathered in groups, readying themselves for the onslaught. The dogs, Napoleon's loyal enforcers, barked and howled in the distance, their voices carrying the chilling promise of violence. The rest of the animals, their hearts heavy with dread, but also stirred by the fire of defiance, lined up on the farm's outskirts, determined to protect what little they had left. When Frederick's men finally arrived, their faces twisted with malice, the attack was swift and brutal. They stormed the farm with vicious intent, armed with guns and tools of destruction, eager to tear down the windmill that represented the last shred of progress the animals had achieved. The battle that ensued was one of blood and anguish, the air thick with the sounds of shouting, gunfire, and the frantic scramble of hooves and paws. Snowball's vision of unity in battle, a collective effort to defend the farm, had been long abandoned. Now, the animals fought for their survival, and they fought with all they had left. The dogs, once their protectors, were now the instruments of Napoleon's wrath, pouncing on Frederick's men with terrifying precision. The horses, large and strong, kicked and bit their attackers, their bodies bruised and bloodied from the violence. The sheep, in their confusion, bleated helplessly, caught in the chaos of the battle. The pigs, safe in their privileged positions, watched from behind the lines, directing the strategy but never once lifting a hoof to fight. The windmill, the object of so much labor and hope, stood at the heart of the battle, its walls now shattered by the cruel assault. The stones that had once formed the foundation of the animals' dreams were now reduced to rubble, a symbol of their shattered hopes. The windmill had been their beacon, a promise of a brighter future, but now it was just another casualty in a war that seemed endless. As the battle raged on, the tide of the conflict began to turn. The animals, exhausted and wounded, fought with everything they had, driven by the memory of their early triumphs, by the flickering flame of the revolution that had once burned so brightly. And in the end, after what felt like an eternity, the human attackers were forced to retreat, their morale broken, their plans thwarted. The animals, though battered and bruised, had won at least. That's how Napoleon framed it. In the aftermath of the battle, as the animals surveyed the damage, Napoleon was quick to declare victory. He stood before them, his chest puffed with pride, his voice booming with false confidence. "We have triumphed," he proclaimed, his words meant to drown out the fear and despair that lingered in the air. "We have defended Animal Farm against the enemies of our revolution." But the animals saw the truth. The windmill was gone, reduced to a pile of stone and dust, its remains scattered across the battlefield. Many had been injured, some even killed. Their bodies lay strewn on the ground, their lives sacrificed for a war that had cost them everything. The battle may have been won, but the victory felt hollow. The pain of their losses hung heavy in the air, a reminder that for all their sacrifices they had gained nothing. Napoleon, however, was determined to twist the truth to suit his own agenda. He called the Battle of the Windmill, a heroic name meant to immortalize their victory in the annals of history. He ordered medals of honor to be awarded to the bravest fighters, though none of the animals could quite remember what they had fought for anymore. Napoleon, of course, made sure to reserve the highest honors for himself and the pigs, claiming that without their leadership, Animal Farm would have fallen. The animals, too afraid to protest, accepted the medals and accolades, even though they knew deep down that the true cost of the battle was something they would never be able to repay. And so, in the aftermath of the battle, the farm continued on, its future uncertain. The windmill lay in ruins, its once promising future shattered by the relentless forces of greed, betrayal, and violence. The animals, broken and bruised, continued their labor, their spirits crushed beneath the weight of their suffering. Yet, despite it all, they pressed on, driven by the faint hope that one day the revolution would be reborn, that one day the dream of Animal Farm would be realized. But deep in their hearts, the animals knew the truth. The revolution had long since died. All that remained was the hollow shell of a dream, twisted and corrupted beyond recognition. The days that followed the destruction of the windmill seemed to stretch endlessly, a never-ending series of long hours filled with hard work, harsh realities, and a growing sense of despair. The once bright and hopeful spirits of the animals had been dulled, worn thin by the constant labor, the ever-shifting lies, and the ever-tightening grip of Napoleon's rule. But through it all, there remained one constant, a figure of strength, endurance, and unwavering loyalty. Boxer, the mighty cart horse, continued to labor on, his muscles rippling with the effort as he hauled heavy loads and worked tirelessly to rebuild the windmill. Boxer had always been the heart of the farm, the symbol of the working class, a creature whose determination and work ethic had inspired the other animals to push through their exhaustion, to believe in the possibility of a better future. His strength was unmatched, and his loyalty to the cause was unquestionable. He was the one who believed in the revolution with all his heart, who gave everything he had to the cause. The pigs had come to rely on him, not just as a worker, but as the pillar upon which the entire farm's efforts rested. Yet even Boxer, for all his strength, could not withstand the toll that the endless work was taking on his body. The farm was constantly demanding more from him, and though he never complained, his body began to break down. His once strong legs, which had carried him through countless tasks, began to show signs of wear. His hooves, worn raw from the unrelenting work, were often swollen and sore, and his back, once as sturdy as the land itself, began to bend under the weight of the work that never ceased. Still, Boxer did not slow down. He would not stop, not while there was work to be done. He kept pushing himself, day after day, even as his joints ached and his body begged for rest. His only hope, the only thing that kept him going, was the promise Napoleon had made that once the windmill was finished, once the farm had prospered, he would be able to retire, to live a life of ease. This was what he believed. This was what he dreamed of, as he worked himself into the ground. "I will work harder," he would say, his voice firm, his spirit unbreakable. The words became his mantra, the promise he made to himself and to his fellow animals. But as the weeks wore on, it became clear that Boxer's body was not going to hold up under the pressure. One cold morning, as he was hauling a heavy load of stones to the windmill site, his front hoof cracked under the strain, sending a jolt of pain through his leg. He stumbled, his face contorted in agony, and collapsed onto the cold earth. The animals gathered around him, their faces filled with concern, but Boxer, ever the optimist, simply muttered, "It's nothing, just a little pain. I'll be fine. I'll work through it. We must finish the windmill." But the pain did not go away. It only worsened. The once proud and mighty Boxer, whose every movement had been a symbol of strength, was now lying helpless on the ground, unable to rise. His heart, full of determination and loyalty, was now heavy with the realization that the end of his days as a worker on Animal Farm was drawing near. Napoleon, sensing an opportunity to avoid any further questions about Boxer's condition, promised that the old horse would be sent to the veterinary hospital in Willingdon. Boxer believed him, as did the other animals. They knew that Napoleon had the power to arrange for the best care. "Napoleon will take care of you," they told Boxer, their voices filled with hope. Boxer, though in pain, was comforted by the thought that he would be taken care of, that his hard work would not be forgotten, that he would be able to retire in peace. But what the animals did not know, what they could not have possibly imagined, was that Napoleon had no intention of sending Boxer to a veterinary hospital. There was no care waiting for him, no gentle hands to tend to his wounds. Instead, in a cold and calculated decision, Napoleon sold Boxer to the highest bidder, a glue factory, where his body would be turned into profit for the pigs to spend on their lavish lifestyle. The pigs, their appetites growing ever more insatiable, had long since abandoned any pretense of loyalty to the animals who had sacrificed so much. They had grown fat and comfortable, their greed now the driving force behind every decision. They had no use for a crippled old horse who could no longer work. Boxer, whose every ounce of strength had been devoted to the farm, was no longer of any value to them. His fate had been sealed the moment he could no longer labor. The farm needed money, and Boxer's life was worth little more than a sum to satisfy the pigs' cravings for luxury. The news of Boxer's fate did not come immediately, but when it did, it shattered the fragile peace that had settled over the animals. Squealer, ever the loyal propagandist, arrived with his usual smarmy smile, spinning the lie that would become the final wound inflicted on the animals' hearts. He assured them that Boxer had indeed been sent to the veterinary hospital, that he had died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by kind and caring humans who had given him the best possible treatment.
They gave him a great send-off, Squealer said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. He was a brave animal, and we shall always remember his service to Animal Farm. May his memory live on as an example to us all.
The animals were devastated. They had watched Boxer labor his entire life, giving everything he had to the cause, and now they were told that he had died peacefully, that his sacrifice had been a noble one, that his memory would live on in the hearts of all who had known him. But deep down, they knew the truth. They knew that Boxer's death had been anything but peaceful. They knew that he had been betrayed, sold like a piece of property, discarded when he could no longer serve the pigs' needs. And yet, none of them dared to speak the truth. Fear had become a silent presence on Animal Farm, a presence that held them all in its grip. They had seen too many of their comrades disappear, too many of their fellow animals dragged away in the night, never to return. The very air seemed thick with the weight of their silence. They could not speak out. They could not challenge Napoleon. For to do so would mean certain punishment, a punishment worse than anything they had yet endured. As the days passed, the animals carried on with their work, their hearts heavy with the weight of what had happened to Boxer. They pushed themselves harder than ever, their spirits crushed beneath the burden of their unacknowledged grief. The windmill, once a symbol of hope, was now just another reminder of how far they had fallen, of the broken promises and lies that had built their lives. But the loss of Boxer was more than just a blow to the animals' morale. It was a turning point, a moment when the dream of animalism, the dream that had once filled their hearts with hope, finally died. Boxer had been the embodiment of everything they had once believed in: loyalty, hard work, and the idea that all animals were equal. And now, that belief lay shattered, trampled beneath the hooves of the pigs who had sold out every value they had once held dear. The animals, lost in their sorrow, could only look back at the days when they had believed in the revolution. They could only wonder what had happened to the world they had once dreamed of, a world where animals could live free from the tyranny of humans, where they could work for their own benefit, not for the pigs who had betrayed them. But there was no answer. Only silence. Only the memory of a horse whose loyalty had never faltered, even when the world around him had fallen apart. Boxer was gone, and with him, so was the last flicker of hope that Animal Farm had ever had. And so, the animals labored on, day after day, their bodies aching, their spirits broken, and their hearts heavy with the knowledge that their dream had died, and it had died with the one animal who had believed in it the most. The years slipped by, each one feeling heavier than the last. The once vibrant and hopeful energy that had suffused the fields of Animal Farm had slowly drained away, leaving behind only the faint echoes of a dream long forgotten. The animals who had once fought so passionately for the ideals of animalism now found themselves old, worn, and weary. The world had changed around them, but the changes were not the ones they had imagined. No longer did they hear the echoing sound of hooves in harmony, or the proud chorus of beasts of England rising above the fields. Now, there was only the heavy silence of work, broken by the occasional grumble of hunger, the sharp crack of a whip, and the cruel, ever-present reality of the pig's power. Boxer's absence was still felt by many, the old horse's name whispered with reverence in the corners of the barn, a memory that reminded them of the ideals they once believed in. But the world had moved on, and with each passing day, the dream of a world where animals were free from human oppression seemed to slip further away, buried beneath the weight of their own survival. They had built a new society, but the foundation was cracked, and the walls were now held together with lies, corruption, and fear. The pigs, those creatures who had once stood at the forefront of the revolution, were no longer the comrades they had once been. They had transformed into something unrecognizable. Their bodies had grown fat with indulgence, their faces twisted by greed and power. Their actions, once motivated by a desire for equality, were now driven by the same selfishness and oppression that they had once despised in humans. The way they walked had changed. No longer did they trot on 4 legs like the other animals, but instead, they strutted around the farm on 2 legs, their bodies swaying with a new, uncomfortable elegance. They wore clothes now, clothes taken from the humans they had driven away, and they carried whips as if they had always known how to wield such authority. The old commandments that had once adorned the walls of the barn were now nothing but faded words, their meaning distorted and eroded by time and power. The animals who once gathered to read the 7 guiding rules of animalism now found themselves confused and disillusioned. The words had changed. One by one, they had been altered, scratched out, and rewritten, until there was only one left. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. This final commandment was the bitter fruit of all their struggles, a cruel mockery of everything they had worked for. And still, the animals worked. They worked as they always had, with no hope of respite. The fields were still plowed, the crops still harvested, but there was no joy in it anymore. They had learned to accept the harshness of their reality, their labor now a form of survival rather than a means to achieve the equality they had dreamed of. The pigs no longer needed to justify their privileges. Their power had become so absolute, so unquestioned, that the other animals were too afraid to even ask why they were being asked to work harder and harder for less and less. The hens who had once rebelled against Napoleon's orders, now quieted and broken, had long since given up any hope of ever seeing their eggs returned to them. They had been silenced by the whips of the pigs, their resistance crushed by brute force and fear. The sheep, who had once been so eager to chant slogans in the name of animalism, had become mindless creatures, bleating whatever words the pigs told them to say. They no longer had the energy to question, to think, to dream. It was then, in the final days of the farm's slow descent into despair, that the last great betrayal took place. The pigs, who had once driven away the humans, had now become indistinguishable from them. Napoleon, the tyrant who had once claimed to stand for the animals, now dined with the very humans they had fought so hard to drive away. The walls of the farmhouse, once forbidden to all animals, were now open to the pigs, who walked through the door with the same air of entitlement as the humans who had owned the land before them. It was a cold, dark evening when the animals gathered in the yard, their faces turned toward the farmhouse, drawn by an unfamiliar noise. Through the small windows of the farmhouse, they saw the pigs sitting at a table, drinking glasses of liquor and laughing loudly. Their voices were full of the kind of boisterous joy that only comes with power and excess. Around the table, the humans, the very same humans they had once feared, once despised, sat, joining in the celebration as though they were old friends, familiar companions. There was Mr. Pilkington, the grumpy old farmer from the neighboring farm, shaking hands with Napoleon and sharing jokes. There was Mr. Frederick, his face twisted into a grin, as he passed around a bottle of whiskey. The pigs raised their glasses in a toast, the glint of their eyes as cold and sharp as any human's. Their laughter echoed through the walls of the farmhouse, mingling with the deep, guttural sounds of the men. They were no longer just collaborating with humans, they had become them. The animals stood outside, their breath clouding in the cold air, and watched in stunned silence. For the first time since the rebellion, they saw with their own eyes what they had only sensed in their hearts for so long. The dream was dead. The revolution had failed, and the pigs, the very ones who had promised to lead them to a better world, had become no different from the humans they had once overthrown. Their faces, bloated with greed, their clothes fine and expensive, their voices mocking the struggle that had once united them. These were the very same creatures that had once pledged to create a world where all animals were equal. As they stood there, unable to tear their eyes away from the sight in the window, something inside them broke. They had fought so hard for so little, only to be betrayed by the very leaders they had trusted. They had worked themselves to the bone, toiled and bled for a dream that had slowly and quietly slipped away. But now, the truth was impossible to ignore. The pigs had become what they had once hated. One by one, the animals turned away, their hearts heavy with a sorrow that they could no longer contain. They had lost so much, so many of their friends, so many of their comrades, and now they had lost their dream. They could no longer remember what it had been like to believe, to hope, to dream of a better future. All they could see now was the cold, unfeeling reality of the world they had built for themselves, a world where all animals were equal, but some animals were more equal than others. The sound of the pigs laughing echoed through the night, a reminder of how far they had fallen. The animals, once proud and hopeful, were now broken, their faith in the revolution shattered. They could no longer tell the difference between the pigs and the humans. And as the moon hung high in the sky, casting its pale light over the fields, The animals knew, in the deepest corners of their hearts, that they had been betrayed not just by the pigs, but by the very ideals they had once held dear. The dream of animalism was dead. And with it, any hope of a future where they could live free, where they could live equal. And so they worked, as they had always done. But now, it was not for a dream. It was simply to survive.